Speech start in 3, 2, speech start in 3, 2, 1. Panel, one of the greatest part of providing closure is ensuring that you do not search and continuously figure out what's going on with your family, or whether or not this is, or whether or not you can still do something. Telling them that you have done enough and telling them that this is something and that we have already done our best and you are a great family for doing so, and you do not need to do any more effort to do so anymore. What we provide under site opening government is allowing these families to provide them closure, to say that they have done enough, to say that we have done everything that we can in order to figure out what's happened to your beloved family, and it's time for you to take a rest. It's time for you to let it go. It's time for you to move on at the end of the day. Even though this is a hard process, even though that this is a process that would create a lot of fear, a lot of division, a lot of mental trauma for you as an individual, this is something that we want to go through in order to tell them that at least there's nothing that they can do anymore. It is incredibly humane to do so. We want to humanize the idea of allowing them to gain closure, even though it is a hard-pull process at the end of the day. A couple of models before we continue in this debate, right? Firstly, we're in this specific debate happens in a context of cold cases, right? So this means that this is a case that has gone through massive amounts of process of investigation and without any source of ant tunnel, right? We don't find any chances to find who is the murderer, for example, and etc. Right? This is a cold case that has gone for months, not during the investigation. So I don't want any opposition or closing thing that to say that this is going to ruin the process of the investigation, because I'm assured that we are not going to do so, because specifically they was reduce the means of investigation, for example, to give a huge knowledge for the family, but our dynamic between the attorney and etc. for the individual who is considered to be, for example, the suspect and etc. Right? So this happens after a massive amount of investigation at the end of the day, right? Secondly, just because we're going to do this doesn't mean that it's going to reduce the amount of investigation that we're going to have. We're still going to go through a lot of investigation. We're just going to do it afterward, for example. Thirdly, we're still going to involve the family in the process of investigation. We're just not revealing the specific information. So I believe it is quite normal for family to be put into the investigation process without this particular knowledge during the processes and only provide this afterwards, for example. Thirdly, we're only going to share, fourthly, we're going to share this only to family and going to make them sign an NDA agreement, for example, to not go to the press, not provide this to the public, and also common practices where with the law investigator and etc. take deals with individuals at the end of the day to provide non-disclosure agreement and
Point of
etc.
information.
Fifthly, no, thank you. This family can still choose to read it or not, so we're going to mail it in forms of mail and etc. They can determine whether or not they are ready to view this particular folder at the end of the day. It is entirely up to them. We're not going to force them to read it at the end of the day, right? All right, so we have explicitly told you that this is specifically happening in a cold case environment, and we don't want any change to that. Hopefully, later on in the debate, we will have a smooth debate. To argument, firstly, principally, why is it something that is justified and something that we've already done an extension of everything that we've done before? Secondly, in terms of closure and providing aid to mental state of the family, right? Why is this something that is principally justified? Firstly, the criminal justice system is all about giving closure as something that is the most important. This is why we have showmanship. This is why we have banding. We could do court inside a private processes, but we do it in a manner that can be seen by everyone and etc. Right? The reason why we want to do this is because we want to allow process and closure towards the victim and towards the family at the end of the day. Right? The reason why we have showmanship in this. So in principle, allowing and giving closure is also the most important thing. Not just providing punishment to a certain individual, but also giving closure to the family, for example. We allow them to go through the investigation process. We give them some information that can prove to be quite dangerous, even though we still do it at the end of the day. Secondly, the principle of idea of gathering information, even at the cost of trauma and stress, right? So I'm pretty sure that opposition is going to come in and say that this is going to bring a lot of trauma and stress for this family the moment that we reveal this information, right? So the principle here is that through precedents, we have always uphold the idea of closure and gathering information above the idea of providing trauma and stress and etc. Right? We still allow we force our victim to meet the perpetrator inside the court, for example, or like allow family and witnesses to be inside the process in order to find firmacy. Like throughout processes, for example, we have always allowed family to take part and such. So the criminal justice system has always put transparency and information about the idea of mental health, even though it is something that's incredibly harmful for the victim at the end of the day. Why? Because this is a process that requires solvency, and this is a process that, for example, requires the specific information for them, allowing the victim closure, making sure that they are part of it, even though it can be quite traumatizing. So through precedents, we have always put this type of thing above the idea of mental strain and trauma. Later on, lastly, like in terms of principle, privacy and keeping to the death, the beloved death dignity and etc. I feel like if opposition wants to bring the idea of dignity and privacy, we feel like privacy is a concept that only exists towards the living, right? That doesn't allow you any more privacy that is a right. You are reduced of that particular right at the end of the day. This is proven by the precedents that we have done, for example, investigation with their body. We have damaged their body, for example, in order to know what has happened to it at the end of the day. So dignity is not something that we really care, is not provided towards the death, knowing the fact that throughout the investigation process, there has already been precedent in which we sacrifice those dignity, we sacrifice the bodily autonomy of that particular individual. So yeah, this is only an extension of existing policy that we have in the criminal justice system, and we say this is something that is justified. Secondly, closure and providing aid to mental state. So let's analyze what happened during cold case. During cold case, family feels like they're desperate, feels like the criminal justice system hasn't treated them properly, and there's something and more to be done at the end of the day. Or you feel like your beloved one is acting uncharacteristically. You're confused as to why they go out at night, for example, right? There's confusion as to why they're doing all of these things and why do they, are able to be put in this particular situation. Why does all of this exploration will be aided the moment that we provide this particular information? Firstly, part of the closure that we want to provide is telling them we have done our best here, all the proof that we have, and there's nothing that we can do anymore at the end of the day, allowing them, humanizing the idea that you've done enough, and sometimes there are things that you could not figure out and you need to move on as an individual. More likely after their side, what they're going to do is that they're going to go through private investigative journalism, so that they can at least find and figure out and make sense of all of this confusion at the end of the day. But when we provide this particular information, all of those other avenues that they're going to use, like investigative journalism, private investigator, and etc., it's not going to work, because now those individuals is going to see that you already have all of the evidence at the end of the day, and there's nothing that we can do anymore as an individual. We understand that this is a painful process and sometimes can be excruciating, but at least it will be short term. On their side, the closure and the harm of not providing closure and confusion is a harm that continuously lingers on them. On our side, perhaps it will be a cathartic experience and a very exclusive experience at short term, but at least you're allowed to move on, and at least you're allowed the ability to humanize the idea that you cannot do anything as a human, you have limited capacity. Very proud to propose.
Thank you. I'm calling Leader of Opposition.
Check, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. Untuk I di chat aja ya, because I'm gonna read it. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. So where is team opening opposition standing, right? We want the family, obviously, to also know about what happened with their relatives that is dead. The difference is, I think that this death case, for example, can only be disclosed, the full information and also some specific information about this particular case can only be disclosed should the report is final, ladies and gentlemen, should the investigation already final, right? Because I think that under opening government, we are going to prove to you why then in opening government, it will make, for example, the deceased family to be worse, and even the entire criminal justice system is going to worse under their side of the house, right? But before that, I'm going to engage two things in opening government. First of all, they talk about closure. But under opening opposition, ladies and gentlemen, for example, we also still disclose the progress of that massive investigation, right? I think that disclosing the progress of this particular investigation is at the very least will be able to be given to give the closure that is needed by this deceased family at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen. Disclosing the progress on how far have we been going in every week, for example, is something that is able to give closure to this particular family, right? And I also think that the reason why, for example, closure exists, it's because we do not have any kind of report or even progress at the end of the day, or even our investigator team, for example, is not able to reach us to inform their progress and so on and so forth. I think once we do this, for example, I think that the idea of closure, at the very least, knowing the progress of this report, for example, has been achieved under opening opposition, right? So second of all, what we are trying to say is about the mental state of the deceased family. What you need to understand is that once a death case happened, for example, a state department sometimes pay attention to their family, for example, making sure that the mental state of this family that is left by this dead son, for example, is going to be okay, is going to be able to survive, ladies and gentlemen, right? I think that the idea of facilities about this mental state, on how in the United States, for example, this particular state department is paying attention to the deceased family, on how, for example, that also exists in Indonesia, where we are paying attention to the deceased family. It's totally viable under our serve the house, right? So I do not necessarily think that the worriness coming from opening government is that extravagant to begin with. I'm going to bring several things, but first let's talk about the value of the information and whether or not this will be able to give the closure that opening government tried to champion, right? What opening government never explained to this debate is that how investigation work in an unsolved death case, ladies and gentlemen. So first of all, how investigation work? Investigation works in 4 steps, right? First of all, obviously we need to investigate, like for example, going to the field and so on and so forth. And second, we are going to establish the preliminary cases, for example. And second, we are going to bring it to JAXA. And last is the court trial process, ladies and gentlemen. The moment when we identify a case as an unsolved death cases, this is still in a step where we are still establishing a preliminary case at the end of the day, right? What does this mean? It's not even valued that it's not even valid at all to be taken to JAXA, for example, right? Why? Because this type of information that you got has no values at all, ladies and gentlemen, since you are still far away from its finalization, right? You are still in a step where you are establishing the preliminary cases on how, for example, it might happen, right? Why is it bad, ladies and gentlemen? Because I think your information has no value and can change due to externalities or new evidence that you get during the process of that investigation, ladies and gentlemen. What does it mean? It means no thank you. What does it mean? It means please do chat, yeah. Family and their opening governments of the house will not find closure because they know that they are given an information that is not final. Telling them for the sake of closure is not closure. That is an illusion of closure that we give to the family, ladies and gentlemen. They think that their son was killed because certain cause, because someone, for example, killed them, while on the other hand, once the report progressing, for example, the cause of their death might be different at the end of the day, right? So we do not necessarily think that family will get closer under their side of the house, ladies and gentlemen, right? I think telling them of a not finalized information is not a closure that this family got, and that is totally evil for you to do that, right? Because you, for example, finally get away from the report and say, look, the family has got the closure that they want, for example, ladies and gentlemen, right? This is the reason why an incentive of you to actually finding the truth on why their son, that, for example, is not going to exist under opening government. You are only giving this particular family an illusion that they get closure while they are not, and this is able to tackle the justification point that is coming from Bobby, right? This is the reason why when they are not getting the truth is not closure at all, ladies and gentlemen. Maybe under both sides of the house, opening government and opening opposition, this particular family will be sad. This particular family will be stressful. But at the very least, under opening opposition, we are sad about the truth. We are stressful about the truth, ladies and gentlemen. What their family stressing in opening government is something that is not necessarily the truth, right? This is the reason why it is much more harmful and unjustified under opening government side of the house, ladies and gentlemen. But second of all, why it is going to be bad for the family and overall criminal justice system, right? Because this particular unsolved death cases information to be told to the family will push this particular family to do vigilantism, ladies and gentlemen. Because of what? Because you have allowed this particular family to be clouded by their anger. This is the reason why they will undergo a lot of silly judicial procedures, ladies and gentlemen. While first they take their own conclusion, and number two, for example, they, for example, hire any kind of investigation that is that the accountability might not always be good at the end of the day, right? I think that this is something that is very dangerous at the end of the day, right? Because I think that taking their own conclusion will misleading them to actually finding the truth about what happened to their dead son and so on and so forth, right? I think this is something that we want to champion. Look, under opening opposition, we don't entirely close the information. Okay, we tell you the progress of how the investigation goes, and I think it's enough closure at the end of the day. And once the case solved, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to tell you the final report under our side of the house. We are very proud to oppose the motion.
Thank you, OO. To continue the case of OG, I call upon the Deputy Prime Minister.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Okay. I'm gonna take POI through chat. So I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1, start. So the entire stance of opening opposition is that once the case is solved, then they are going to share the information. This is a principled concession that at the end of the day, the specific privacy of the person who is deceased is already reduced. And even if there's trauma, etc., that can come from this specific information, they are willing to share it at the end of the day. So on their side of the house, they are still willing to share the same amount of information as OG, only at a different time frame. So this is a principal concession that you need to deal with. 3 things I want to talk about in my speech. Number 1, closure to engage with OO. Number 2, investigation by the family, which we say is inevitable, engaging with OO. Thirdly, I'm going to re-engage and frame up what the most of Bobby's speech, which was not engaged with by the opening opposition so far. First, closure. OO mentioned that they are still going to involve the family to an extent. So this is a principled concession that giving information to the family is something that is totally normal. But what else did they say? They said that this is not going to be extravagant information, so they won't care that much. But at the same time, they say it's going to be traumatic. They need to pick a side. If it's not going to be extravagant information, then it can't possibly traumatize them, because if it's going to be like useless information, that it wouldn't traumatize them. It's going to be seen like trivial information. Next, their whole idea about there's no value in this information, of how there is just an illusion. They're talking about the idea of value from the perspective of the criminal justice system, as in what is like admissible proof and etc. But the value of this information is different for the family. Why? Let me give you the example. If it's scars, they at least know how hurt they were during the months leading up to their death. So they at least know why possibly the person in their family was acting erratic for a long time, or they were walking with a limp, why they were not comfortable with showing off their body at home. If it's the background profile of either the potential perpetrator or the deceased, at least the family finally knows where they went for such a long time. At least finally able to fill in the blanks and know what happened to this person in the months leading up to their death. So it is something, the value of this information is not the same between the court and the family. For the family, the value of this information is that they can start to fill in the blanks. If you have an update on the information, good, then just tell them that. We don't limit this information as a one-time thing. If they find more information, then they can give it to them. Second, I'm going to talk about investigation. So Oo talked about vigilantism and how bad it is, but the problem is the driving factor in vigilantism, or like searching for an initial investigation. The driving factor is the love for their family. If it's going to be a cold case on op, they're going to start investigating on their own, because at the end of the day, on their side of the house, if the case is not solved, there's very slow progress that is happening, then the family will still be incented to look for their own investigators. So at the end of the day, and especially if you don't inform them, that makes them think that the investigators are slacking. That makes them think that the investigators are not putting in full efforts. This gives them the false confidence or a distrust to the justice process, and makes them even more likely to go through these individual investigation processes. So we say on that second idea, it is still possible for them to do vigilantism on their side, especially knowing that this is an unsolved case. Before I move on, the OO has really not engaged with the setup we brought. We told you it mentioned it's an unsolved case, and it is something where the perpetrators are not caught. So most likely this is a cold case where it's gone on for too long. Second, when it comes to the offense of the family, again, we still allow the family to choose not to read it or not. If it's a problem of mental health or not something that they're not ready to read it, we are only going to give them the document, and it is up to them to read it. If only the father can read it, sure. But if the mother and the daughter cannot read it, then the father's going to keep that information until they are mentally ready, once they have some time away from the event. So the idea of like the shock from this from seeing this is not going to be completely exclusive. Before I move on to Bobby's case, POIO.
If the family doesn't know the content of the document before they open it, isn't that going to be traumatized when they know the content? They cannot possibly know beforehand whether or not they're going to be traumatized.
It goes back to the individual. If they know someone in their family that has a strong mental strength, someone that is stoic enough, someone that is not super emotional, they can be the ones that bear the burden. They can go through the fire first. If the father is like the stoic, calm one, they can open it first, and they can determine if the rest of their family can. And if at the end of the day, none of them want to open it, that's fine. We at least uphold the idea that we are giving this option to them. We are not going, as the criminal justice system, we are not going to pick and choose who is strong enough to read this. It is going to be up to them at the end of the day. Framing onto Bobby's point, why this is justified, and it's just an extension of the status quo. We already allow try to get closure by either punishing the perpetrators or informing the people. If we already fail in punishing or catching the perpetrator, at the very least we can inform them a little bit more. And when it comes to the privacy of the dead, it is already given up when you are dead. When you're part of the investigation, the people in the detective force can already know everything you're doing. The fact that the investigative force already like look at everything in your body, look in your background, etc. I'm going to add to this. The value of privacy to begin with is you don't want someone to judge you and limit what you can do in your life. For example, you don't want someone to know your browsing history because you don't want to be judged for what you are doing. But once you're dead, you don't have that limitation or that desire anymore. So this value of privacy of the dead is not that important anymore. But framing. We acknowledge that the person who is dead has some rights, like their body shouldn't be messed with. You shouldn't publicly display their body. But at the same time, we understand that there's compromises that happen in the status quo. Your body can be recovered for a burial, for the closure of the family. You can be cremated by your family also. And there are two other principles that you have to compare with this. Number one is the right of the public and right of the public to try and find the perpetrator and to reduce the chances that this perpetrator can do harms in the future. So your right for your privacy is not 100%, because the fact that you're already part of the investigative process means that the public and law in general already agrees that you can be that can be compromised. And secondly, you also have the family's right to closure as well, to avoid the mental harm of being uninformed. We understand that this is not going to be perfect. We understand that for some people, looking at this information is going to make it worse. But that's exactly why we don't force it onto them. We don't send them a file that instantly opens and shows everything. We're going to give them this document. If they are not ready, we are going to like verbally tell them, But if they are not ready, they are not going to open it yet. But if given some time, given some other information, given some consolation from their other family members, then they can be able to build up the strength to finally get this information and be one step closer to closure. For all of those reasons, very proud to propose.
Thank you, OG. To continue the case of opening opposition, I call upon Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Okay. Testing, am I audible?
R.
Okay. All right, good. If you'd like to PI, you can interrupt me or write in the chat. I'll check both, no problem. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Members of the House, I'm going to start by describing what is happening in the status quo and what happens under the model of the opening government. So what happening in the status quo is right now, a lot of what the opening government is talking about is already a statement of what happens in the status quo. So when there are cases of public interest, then the police department makes updates, and these updates are made public. They generally do press conferences on it. If you have a family of a case in which privacy is needed, then generally greater and more detailed information for the family is provided on the progress of the case and the situation. When cases are stopped, so in these cases of cold cases, for example, the evidence that are lacking in order what are lacking in order to continue the case are given, and the reason why there is a statement of investigation being stopped is given to the family. There are several contexts to this situation in which that the kind of information police provides are information that doesn't identify any potential suspect, information that doesn't identify any potential witnesses, that doesn't identify any evidence obtained through multiple sources, such as secret wiretaps or ongoing investigation and so on. They are generally filtered and checked first whether they are prejudicial to the rights of other individuals. Now, this information, if that's the closure that's necessary, it seems to me is already enough in most circumstances. However, what the opening government wants, it seems to me, is more detail rather than this, right? They want information, for example, evidence by how and which we are determining certain events to be true, evidence of what events they've been described, and also very importantly are the details of individuals who are potential suspects to this case, members of the House. We think that this is harmful. We think that this is not acceptable in this model, in this approach, and that this family is not entitled to this, because this is a violation of several government principles that are higher or at least of equal importance to the right of a family to achieve closure. What are those rights? First, this is the violation of rights of potential suspects, members of the House. The problem here is that court standards is innocent until proven guilty, and that there is also a standard of beyond reasonable doubt for this establishment. Notice that it's very important for us to understand that investigation results does not give us the real perpetrator. This is not Detective Conan, okay? The real perpetrator is determined by the court after the court show that there is beyond after the prosecutor managed to prove beyond reasonable doubt that an individual is a suspect. Yes, closing government.
In most of murder case, the police and the investigator have the knowledge of who is the perpetrator, but they do not have enough evidence to prosecute. Why do you think in that case this particular victim family cannot know this information?
They cannot know it because we don't actually know whether the person who is perpetrator is a person who is actual murderer. The police can be wrong, and they're often wrong very often they're wrong. In many murder cases, if the prosecutors are very certain that the individual is the murderer, when the police is very certain that the individual is the murderer, the individual walk free because of lack of evidence, because lack of information, and so on. That's how our criminal justice system is set up and established, members of the House. So here, the problem here is that in the criminal justice system, this is operationalized by the state representative being the prosecutor being required to prove their case as to the guilt of the defendant, members of the House. And I say, and of course, the violation of the right of potential suspects is that in the CGR, of course, they go to jail or even face the death penalty. So the standard is higher. However, when you have this kind of information, but information is not clear because this is only preliminary investigation, necessarily because this is not a case being built by the prosecution, okay, rather still case being built by the police, then necessarily in this regard, then this potential suspect will have potential. First, there is potential of the information being shared. There is potential that they are being stigmatized, even by the family, which is unjust. Damaging their reputation in this way is unjust. Secondly, as well, we cannot know whether the family is going to abide by the NDA because they are frustrated, because they're angry, and so on. Therefore, it's also threats to their life and threats to their safety, and therefore this is violation of their right for this potential suspect. Secondly, also, this is also a violation of the confidentiality protection of the witnesses. If government want to cast aspersions of this suspect, well, they're most likely guilty anyway. Just screw them. Then there is also the violation of the confidentiality protection of witnesses, right? Witnesses provide information, but also under secrecy. The information is protected when they're giving witness statements to the court. Okay, sure.
This is not, if you say this isn't Detective Conan, this is not Ace Attorney, right? People just don't go to court all the time, and we don't have a lot of individuals opting into court. This is not a case in that particular case where we do not, this is a case where we do not have suspect that is enough to go to court at the end of the day. So I don't get why is it that in court we have witnesses or individuals.
People don't go to court all the time. This is not people. This is not civil case. This is a criminal case. The decision to go to court is done by prosecutor, and the prosecutor made that decision based on the availability or the strength of evidence. If the prosecution doesn't go to court, that means there is no evidence. If there is no evidence, then there shouldn't be any conviction, and therefore there should not be any prejudicial treatment to any individuals, any information that might create prejudicial treatment to any individual, no matter what evidence you already have. Okay, that is the principle that we are defending. When the protection to witnesses is so strong that witnesses may even withdraw the information before the court. Witnesses are only allowed to, are only required to provide truthful information openly in court when they're protected under oath and on pain of perjury, members of the House. So the problem here is that under the investigation, the witness statement is assumed to be true, but the witnesses are not given protection in this regard. What happens here is that the consequence is that, for example, family can harass these witnesses to provide more information, or family can also have character expression that the witness have bad character, and therefore that is also something that's unjustified and not right to be given to these witnesses, because it is not because they have given their information in the confidence of the police, knowing not for the sake of them reputation being damaged and the reputation being slayed in a case that is not yet proven. Okay, so there is also a violation of confidentiality protection of witnesses. Thirdly, this is also a violation of state secrets doctrine for privileged information. When in the course of an investigation, there is two possibilities that government can use their state powers to obtain secrets that are not achievable. So, for example, the government can ask for phone records, for example, and secondly, the case might be part of an ongoing crime in which the government are doing wiretapping provisions. So on these two cases, therefore, it is possible that the government have information that they obtain only because they are the government. The family of the victim does not have the right to this kind of information, and therefore this information needs to be provided. Without this information, the context is not improved compared to what's happened to status quo. So the benefit doesn't exist. But with this information, the information, you are violating the rights of suspects, the witnesses, and violating the state protection doctrine. So either you don't do it at all, or you don't get any improvement. You don't do it at all, or you violate massive rights. We believe that we should stick with the status quo rather than moving. Thank you.
Thank you, OO. I'm calling member of government.
Check audible.
Yes.
Okay. Let me just set up my own timer real quick. Okay, I'm gonna begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Members of the House, it is the most wretched thing in the world to be bereaved of the most important people in your life and not to even have any time for you to to ponder over how you're going to get through this madness, because you cannot access the stage of rationality that you need in order to process all this information, right? Because the information is not even provided to you. You spend your days lost in a sea of uncertainty, ladies and gentlemen. You're never able to make the necessary connections in order for you to be able to gain that closure. We think that this is a state of affairs that is far more important than the preservation of rights of the potential suspects, right? And this needs to take precedence over that, because what you need to understand is that when laws are made, obviously there's always going to be an exchange of rights, an exchange of principles. We say that the rights of the individuals that are grieving needs to be prioritized, right? Based on the parameter of the certainty of the harm that they experienced. It is certain that they're going to grieve over their loved ones. It is certain they're going to spend their days listlessly, barely being able to get out of their bed, for example, whereas it's deeply uncertain that these potential suspects will feel any repercussions from the information being disclosed, right? Unless opposition bench wants to argue they're going to go to the extent of vigilantism, for example, to make the suspects be punished at all costs, for example, I don't think they can take that particular benefit at the end of the day, right? We think that we need to prioritize the family who is already being grieving, for example, and is already being harmed to this particular extent, and that's exactly why we are proud to stand on closing government, right? Because what you need to understand is that criminal justice system has already failed them to a very massive extent. We have failed to grant them justice. We have failed to grant them all of these things that are, we have even failed to grant the initial protection of their loved ones, for example, to the extent that we need to at least give them this small pittance of closure, for example, that they need to have to move on, right? Moving on to the contribution of closing government. By the way, POI can be done through audio. Okay, yeah. Contribution is regarding how we should allow the family to be able to construct their own reality, right? We're going to be different from opening government and how we achieve closure, because we're going to explain to you on a step-by-step level as to why this information translates into the capacity for individuals to actually gain that closure at the end of the day, right? What you have to understand is that the most crushing thing about having a relative or a loved one die in a manner as gruesome as an unsolved murder is the mystery that's pervading this occurrence. The fact that you will never know why this beautiful soul was ripped from your side. The fact that you can never put a face to the soulless killer who tore their body to shreds. You spend a viciously large amount of time tossing and turning in your bed, trying to reconstruct the last moments that your loved ones spent on this world, wondering whether they suffered or if it was a quick passing, for example. Now, what you need to understand is that in dealing with the aftermath of a trauma, there are multiple stages of emotional state that the bereaved enter. There is a stage where they feel the abhorrent loss that they currently experience at a very high degree and spend their days just trying to function again as a human being. They try to be okay with the empty chairs that they see at breakfast, the photos of their beloved ones being present in their house where the person themselves cannot. These days are spent exclusively wondering, because like wondering is what you have to do in order to search for that information, right? The next stage of that process is when they come to terms with the death and the passing. That's when they're able to construct a new reality for themselves and access their rationality to come to their own conclusions. We'll tell you later why the conclusions they come to will likely be productive for their recovery, right? But what you need to understand is that the trigger for you to move from the first stage to the second is not the passage of time, but rather how many gaps of the puzzle you're able to fill in. You need to minimize the uncertainties that they feel when they go back and forth between theories of how their loved ones died or who killed them, for example. You need to minimize the amount of uncertainty that they feel so that they don't spend like most of their time wondering, but rather fixating on one conclusion and being and focusing on repairing their own mental well-being so that they can be okay with what happened, right? You need to allow them to enter the phase of rationality that wealth of information triggers. Why will the difference in information be significant, right? Because oftentimes, as Jessica told you in the POI, the criminal justice system actually already knows who the perpetrator is, for example, but don't have enough evidence to prosecute this individual, right? Oftentimes, both the family and the criminal justice system has already come to the same conclusions, for example, but because all of the evidence is circumstantial, for example, or because there's only a motive that they cannot prove, like they were there at the time of being, for example, at the time of the crime being committed, for example, you cannot get to the extent that this is actually what happened, for example, right? So that's why the difference in information will be particularly significant, right? So why then will the reality that they construct be a good reality? Because when people have information, what they do, ladies and gentlemen, is that they default to a state of optimism, because that's just a self-defense mechanism that your rationality defaults to preserve your own mental well-being, for example. This is why people, when they're trying to start a new venture, for example, they default to the state, they default to the assumption that things are going to be be okay, even though maybe like the odds are stacked against them. That's why teams who enter NUDC, for example, go in with the assumption they can exceed the expectations of their mentors, for example, exactly because that self-definition of being optimistic is triggered in stressful situations, which this one is actually a stressful situation, right? But this self-defense mechanism cannot be accessed under side opposition because you're not at the state of grief or the state of coming to terms with the loss where you can make any rational conclusions. You're not even in a state of being able to access your rationality, right? Because you're lost in a sea of uncertainty and wondering what the hell happened. So there's too much grief and despair to wade through before you can get to the stage of rationalizing in which your self-defense mechanism will trigger, right? You also default to that state of negativity and not being able to access optimism on opposition side of the house because you're pervaded by your dissatisfaction of police work that has already been done, especially in a context where distrust towards police is at an all-time high. The fact that we disclose things like how we racially profile the perpetrators towards the family of the bereaved, for example, might be a sense of counterbalance towards the fact that the police can be racist and how they go about their work, right? So what we give to these families is a sense of agency and participation in the making of conclusions of what happened to the death of their beloved ones, where the comparative on that side of the house is a completely oblique process in which no transparency is being given with regard to like this information being given to the family, for example, right? So they are now in a state where they have all the cards and they have minimized the uncertainties that they needed to minimize in order to be able to make the conclusions that they need to, right? Even if the conclusion is that their family member died a horrible death, it is better to know because at least you can like minimize the amount of time that you spend wondering, ladies and gentlemen, and you can just focus all of your energy and be in trying to be emotionally okay with that reality rather than trying to be okay with multiple realities, all of which are horrible because you're defaulting to that stage of negativity, right? That's why closure is better achieved under our side of the house, and that's also why closure needs to take precedence over the uncertain harm that will come to the perpetrators themselves or the potential perpetrators, for example. And that's exactly why we're proud to propose.
Thank you, CG. To start the case of CO, I'm calling upon member of opposition.
All right, I'm setting up my timer. For POI, please do the chat. The whole government bench keep talking about how under their side closure will actually be better, right? But it's really confusing because the way the family at the first place doesn't really know the details about how their family relative is dying or how the deaths of their about how it looked like for their family's relative that is dead. We think that the moment when this family actually know about the gory detail about how the relative can be dead, what is the weapon that is used, what is the last condition when the body was found, don't you think this actually create even more trauma and even more scare towards the family at the end of the day when they actually found that this gory detail, the exact gory detail about how they found the body? I don't think that trauma and can be resolved under government bench, and I don't think that there'll be a rational thinking like what CG said under their set because of how this will keep reminding them about how bad they lose their family at the end of the day and how bad the condition of the body at the end of the day, right? This actually will harm them and this will never resolve the trauma that is felt by the family, right? I think that the portrayal will be much more better under our side, which I'm going to explain in my speech. I'm going to talk about two things under my speech. First, I'm going to talk about the reactions of the family and the society regarding the information that is shared in the government world. But secondly, I'm going to talk about why it is better under our world where the information is not shared at all, the knowledge is not shared at all. But let's talk about the unsolved death case first, right? We think that unsolved death case consists of how the informations of the weapons that are used that is used of the killings. Secondly, the methods of the killings that has been investigated by the authorities. Thirdly, the profiling and evidence of profiling coming from third party like witnesses or from CCTV reports and etc. And also the manner of death from the body that is found, right? And what is not found yet is the perpetrators itself, right? We talk about cases like Elisa Lam, who died in the hotel, and cases like and cases something like that. We think that what's vulnerable right now is the mental and emotional condition of the family, and we want to create a world where we can protect this family and family's emotional and mental health, and that can only be achieved under our set, right? First, let's talk about the reactions of the family and the reactions coming from the society, right? Firstly, why under government world, it will create and prolong trauma and suffering from the family. We think that the portrayal of the manner of death when this information is being shared, we think that the portrayal of how the body is found, we think that the portrayal of how the profiling looks like under the government side will actually keep prolonging trauma and suffering coming from the family, right? Because previously, the family has no picturization at all about how the death of their beloved ones will look like, right? The family is very clueless about how the death is going to look like, because they are only informed that their beloved one is dead, but they have no details at all about how the death is going to be look like that. But after knowing the info of the death, because of the sharing of this knowledge and information about the death, I think what's going to happen is that the family will gonna embolden the trauma that is being felt by the family, because previously, of course, they feel sad, of course, they feel mentally drained, but it will actually worsen because of because they finally know and understand about how detailed it is, for example, about how the body is mutilated or whatsoever, right? We think that this is very, very harmful for the family and only prolonging their trauma at the end of the day, right? So we don't get how there's gonna be any recovery or any closure at the end of the day, right? Secondly, this will actually have the reactions coming from the family is that first we agree with our opening because there will be vigilantism, right? But what kind of vigilantism that can exist under our set? We think that not only they will do self-driven investigation by calling the witnesses, for example, but we think that they will share the loss of the family member towards social media, right? They will actually tell that how the police is cannot fully responsible for this. There is no justice, and so on and so forth. Right? With this information that is being shared in the social media of the family, we think that the spread of news and the power of social media that can make anything go viral. There is two things that can happen. First, for the family, there will be a profiling, prejudicial profiling that is going to happen based on the evidence that is found on this information, for example, from CCTV reports or from the witness reports, right? We think that with this incomplete information and witness info that is unclear, there will be an assumption on the basis of phrase. For example, if they see in the CCTV that the perpetrator might be a black man because black man or Mexican man and so on and so forth, right? We think that if these assumptions are being built up and if these information and assumptions is kept being shared, what's going to happen is that there will be a racial profiling that's going to happen for the perpetrator itself, right? This will actually embolden racism the moment when the family share the infos about the CCTV reports or the recording of the CCTV reports or they share the infos regarding the witness about how they see, for example, a stature that look like a black man or look like a Mexican man that kill their beloved ones, right? Because the information is not yet verified and is still incomplete. This confusion and assumption will keep happening, and this what will worsen with the reactions coming from the family. But secondly, the reactions coming from the society. We think when this case can go viral, when the family shares about the little information, what's going to happen is that the society will create a much more bigger disinformation and misinformation, because they will interpret this case into what they believe in. For example, making a YouTube content video about it when they talk about how this is a conspiracy theory, that conspiracy that is about probably a serial killer, about how there is some entity that is killing the victim itself, right? We think that this is bad because this will keep prolonging the family and reminding the family that their beloved one case is not being taken seriously, right? And we think that this under government bench, this is what's going to happen. But why is better under our case, right? We think that it's better if we let the authorities keep the information by themselves, because we are not trained in criminal justice. So it's better if the cops keep the information. It's better to keep the info because it will prevent the act of vigilantism that I'm explaining. It will prevent the act of profiling. It will prevent the spread of disinformation and conspiracy that can be happen under our side in the status quo right now, right? But why closure is better under our side? First, it will be better because there'll be more organized approach. We can sit that there might be a very long investigation that will be ongoing about how to find these perpetrators, and the family will feel a lot of sadness and devastation, right? Because there is no clear information and clear target about who is the perpetrator. But at least healing can be done. We think that healing can be done much better over time. And how are we going to do that? First, because the family have a community and supportive from their family that support them from their losses. Secondly, there are third parties and counseling help from the state, like support group and etc. And thirdly, there is an immortalization of the lost family member through obituary and stories about how the dead members of the family has been good for the people that know the victims. We oppose.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. Wait, hold up. Stop. Hmm. I'm going to start my speech. Oh, wait. Sorry. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Everyone in this debate talks about closure and how important it is for the family of victims. However, no one actually bothers to describe what is closure and how do we typically get closure as the victim of murder as the family, right? We think that closure is used to refer to the sense of catharsis that to come to terms about one's loss. Closure has also come to stand for the constellation of feelings like peace, relief, a sense of justice, and the ability to move on that comes with the finality. We think on choosing government, this debate talk about trauma and how it's going to reduce the ability for individuals to reach closure, right? But what is lacking in the opening debate and also in closing opposition is the fact that even with the absence of information, most individuals are already traumatized with events anyway, right? So this debate needs to talk about whether this information is going to add some degree of agency and how people are going to have feeling of in control when they are given this piece of information, right? All opening debate talks about trauma. For example, like opening bench talks about how this is going to induce more trauma. They talk as if right now in the status quo, without this information, the victim's family are not in the state of trauma, ladies and gentlemen. So we think that on their side, this is such an assumption that they need to prove, but I think it's too late. On OG, they talk about how trauma is okay and we need to prioritize information. There's not necessarily an information as to why having trauma is can be deprioritized, right? CG is the only thing that's going to tell you why absence of information is the primary source and cause of trauma. And this is the reason why giving piece of information is going to be able to create sense of relief and having the ability to reclaim and reconstruct what it means to be the victims of the family murder, right? So we think that in terms of that, this is the piece of contribution that we are very proud to propose in this debate, right? Now, let's talk about trauma, right? The question is that why are people traumatized with murder cases, right? The answer is that there is no absolute trigger. Everyone has different reason as to why they are traumatized. But for victims' family, the absence of information is the primary cause of trauma because an OO they assume that not knowing means you will be numb. You will be absence of emotion. It means that you can switch off that button of emotion. The thing is that it's completely wrong. Within the vacuum of enlightenment, individuals tend to jump to the worst case scenario. They keep on pondering and contemplating towards the worst case scenario, ladies and gentlemen. And we think because of this creates even more traumatic experiences. Victims' family not knowing means they are going to constantly ponder to the what ifs, dwell in the sea of uncertainties, like what Adam told you. This results in a lot of anxiety attack because you don't know what actually happens, at least in comparison to our side when you have peace of enlightenment. For example, when you know where is the place of criminal, you might understand, okay, at that time and at that setting, I have nothing that I can do. I have nothing that I can help to my father, for example, and this is how I move on, that I have done what I do best, and I think that's the way I can move on. We think that this ability to reconstruct reality is especially important when you're going to have closure, right? On OO and CO, the comparison is that they're going to let you know some degree of progress. But what are these progress? Randy talked to you about how we are still going to update you. But what are these updates? If they are still going to give you any piece of information, we think that what OO wants is actually just the same, right? And Randy is actually knifing what Satrio said, right? Because Satrio said about reaching the innocence until proven guilty. But on Randy, they are still going to provide some degree of information, right? So we think that this is not going to be very effective on their side. The conclusion is that given trauma will happen on both sides, this debate needs to be judged by the ability for police to be past the agency and reconstruct the reality towards the victim family, right? So on OO and CO, their case can only run if they can prove and guarantee to us that trauma will not happen. No one can guarantee that in this debate, right? So we think that trauma and whether or not it occurs or not should not be the sole determinant of you judging this debate panel. So we think that only on that sense, opening bench has closed this debate. All right, now let's go to the second issue, right? About how this is going to be the violation of constitution. This is going to like breach witness confidentiality, innocence until proven guilty, and things like that. My only question towards OO on this regard is that why are these elements is important? Does need to prioritize this? They should not be a given just because it's legal. Number one, it's okay to pass the witness confidentiality because witness testimony is not an end, it's a means. It's a means to gather enough evidence to punish the perpetrator. But right now that the investigator and the police institution is failed to give this sense of punishment towards the perpetrator, it's okay to console the family towards the second method of closure, which is to give enough information so they are going to be able to like draw the line why the murder happened, right? So we think that this witness confidentiality is not the absolute thing that we need to prioritize. Never did OO tell you why witness is the most important actor that we need to defend in this debate, right? But second, let's talk about innocence until proven guilty. Because like on OO and to some extent CO, they kind of like talk to you as if these criminal cases are very mysterious, right? You don't know who they are. It's just like you don't know who are the perpetrator and things like that. But most of the time in the criminal cases, the police and the investigator has some degree of reasonable speculation of who is the perpetrator, right? For example, they have the trace of the footsteps, for example, or things like that. But due to the barrier in legal systems, that is not considered enough to be considered as enough evidence to make this perpetrator go to jail, for example. And we think on that regard, because of the inability in legality in order to prosecute because of not enough evidence, we think that it's okay if we give this piece of information to the victim's family, so they are going to be able to use this piece of information to create their sense of finality towards these murder cases. I think that with this way, we think that it's much more important actor that we need to deal with. But lastly, let me deal with one independent rebuttal with CO, right? Because CO thought, okay, this will create conspiracy theory, and this will create like, creating like viral Twitter and things like that. The question is that why the family is going to create that? What is the likelihood? I think it's very unlikely because like there is name smearing laws, like there is like anti-defamation law. So I think that individuals are not likely to do that, and this is just very unlikely. And even without this piece of information, if they want to create conspiracy theory, they will make it anyway. So I think that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. To close the entire debate, I call upon opposition rep.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Let me organize my paper. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to do very simple thing in this debate. I'm going to explain in the chronological order what happens then after this information is being shared. Because I think like the problems with both government bench, and I think like this is the quite reasons why I think this is opposition bench winning, is that while they talk about how this information could give closures, but there's no analysis upon what you going to do after you have this piece of information, right? Is it really that when when you have these informations, when you know that perhaps that your kids, for example, or your husband or your wife, that's by certain things, are you also going to be silenced, or are you going to conduct your own investigations? Or are you going to at large. My speech is debate opening bench and also closing governors under then the information that being shared by under government world and under opposition world. So under government world, the guilty knowledge of information is like with the info slides, right? About exact killing methods, weapons, but also it's about witness testimony. Who is the potential witness that can give informations and proof, for example, from CCTV and third party and all like that. Meanwhile, what in the opposition bench, the information that give is only that your kid is dead, for example, at around this time, for instance, your kid is being murdered, but there is no detail upon how this kid is being murdered, the murder weapon, for example, and all of the things. This is the difference about what happens under government world and what under opposition world. The reasons why I want to clarify these things is because I want to deadlock the closure that is being like glorified by the government bench. When you're talking about the closure is very important, and we need to give closures. The things about that is that closure is uncertain under government world. The reason is that you given informations about how your kid, how your family is dead, for example. You given informations about the method of which your loved one is being dead. What is their suffering for when they're dead? What is the time in which uh, they're being wounded until the time that they're being dead, for example, or the murder weapons or the exact killing methods and all of that. What my question is it really that you're going to feel like healing, or is it really that you're going to rationalize the idea at the point in which you receive these informations? Never really being clear under government world. So we think that if we're talking about closures and the ability for you to rationalize the idea of your loved one being dead, we don't think that this is something that's really clear or being picturized by government world. The only reasoning as to how we can receive closures is simply by times. But we think that even though this is not exclusive, what we're going to champion here under closing opposition is that the notion of that ignorance is a bliss, right? We say that the mechanism that more likely going to be happens or that are going to be taken off by the family under closing opposition world is that, for example, you're going to consult towards uh, your local religious leaders. You're going to have a consult with family or with your neighbors and all of that. You're going to share. You're more likely going to receive more condolences, and you're going to consult about what is then the correct way for you to take grief and to pass on this grief. We agree that this is not exclusive. This hampers efficacy though. The efficacy of this is going to be hampered massively though under government world. The reason is that because exactly the piece of information that is you actually get, right? Because this piece of information is, even though it's true what government web says that there is some certain piece of information, but clarity of this information is not really clear. So most likely you're going to have, for example, like profiling about the man who killed this person is, for example, like only a brown man with this height, for example, like there's no clarity upon who is actually do that. The problem is that you're going to hamper the way in which this family taking closer into their own hand. For example, like when you're talking to the religious leaders, most likely what you're going to talk about is now that whether or not, for example, like my children is being the death of my children is like this, whether or not this you can actually this is actually a good way to die, for example, or whether or not this is actually uh, whether or not whether or not I can actually get closer and all of that. So while the ability of to gain closer under opposition bench world still actually exists, it diminishes when you actually receive this piece of uncertain information that happens under government world. So this is the reasons why we don't think that closure is actually something that they can actually there's something that actually they can actually get right. But what happens then after you actually receive this piece of information? Now, what's most likely scenario is that you're going to feel anger. It's going to hamper your irrationality at the point in which you actually receive the details about how your loved one is actually going to die. It's true what opening opposition says. Most likely what you're going to have is, for example, like vigilantism, taking matter into their own hands. But they never really actually mechanize how this actually look like, right? This look like three things. Number one, this look like what closing opposition say is that you have more likely, for example, like sharing this into like social media, for example. The nuance of this is that, look, my daughter is killed, for example, by this type of man. Please share and told me if you have any informations and all of that. My daughter is like for example, like my father is killed, for example, and police actually doesn't do really anything, so you need to actually help me and give justice towards all of the things. We agree. The problems with this is that the informations that you receive, exactly because this is unsolved death case, is actually information that is really not valid. And the piece of that is that, for example, only proof, for example, from CCTV, from blurry CCTV, for example, or witness doesn't really give much more valid information upon what this actually look like on what actually they do. It's most likely going to be vague information. For example, like brown man with this height, for example, or men with this weight, and then that's actually a valid information that can make sure these people actually going into that's actually useful. So what's going to happen? The problems with that is that this family doesn't have the same training, doesn't have the same capacity as to what this police or institution does. Actually, for example, they don't know whether or not they encounter potential witness, whether or not they should just spy on them or like interrogate them, interrogate them. So there is no really training about what should the correct mechanism what they should do, and this is the reason why it's actually bad. What is the harms then? The harms, most likely you're not going to get closure and traumatized, given that you're still not going to find any perpetrators. The only way you can get closure is if the perpetrator is actually being punished, but it cannot happen under government rule. But secondly, you're going to have false profiling, for example, and false suspect, for example, like black men and all, like the killer is black man, or for example, or brown man, and all of that. This bad because, number one, we're taking we're actually neutralizing the benefit of government bench, while meanwhile we mechanize opening opposition uh, arguments. That's why we proud to oppose.